Chapter 9 discusses social stratification. In the textbook, it specifically is looking at stratification in the United States. However, we can apply stratification to all cultures around the world. So I want to give you a general definition of social stratification, and that refers to a society's categorization of its people into rankings based on socioeconomic tiers on factors such as wealth, income, race, education, power. So if we look at each of those, wealth is the net value of money and asset a person has. So that is not only just the money or the cash that they have, but the amount of all assets that they have. So if they own a home or buildings or business, wealth is the combination of all of those. Where income is just a person's wages or investment dividends. We also stratify based on race, ethnicity, education level, and also power. So remember, people that have a higher amount of power would be at the higher tier than at the lower. So some examples of things that we stratify. Now in sociology, we are looking specifically at stratifying groups of people, but we stratify everything in our culture, not only our culture, but every culture around the world. And so everything we place in a hierarchy with the most desirable being at the top. And then, of course, those are going to be the things that cost the most. So, for example, we stratify cars or types of cars. So you have your basic cars such as your Fords and your Chevys and your Hondas and your Kias. And then you move up the stratification ladder into the Cadillacs and the Lincolns and the Lexus and Audis. And then, of course, Porsche and BMW and Mercedes and all of those. And so we stratify them into different levels. We stratify the food we eat. So steak is going to cost more than just hamburger. Seafood's going to cost more than Italian. So we stratify that. You stratify the types of clothes you wear by the brands that you buy and the stores that you buy them in. We can even stratify different types of pens. If you look at the pen you're writing with, we have very expensive brands of pens called Mont Blancs or Cross pens, all the way down to the cheap pens of Bic and what else is there? I don't know. Papermate. So again, we stratify everything. So specifically want to look at stratifying of groups of people based on some factor, such again as wealth, income, race, education, and power. When we look at stratification, there are 4 principles of stratification. Basically, 4 fundamental elements of stratification. Number 1, stratification is a trait in all societies. So it's not just in the wealthy industrial nations such as the United States. It is found in all societies. So all societies have some form of inequality. What that inequality is based on and why may vary, but all societies have a trait of stratification, and in all societies that inequality serves a specific function. The second principle is that stratification is universal but varied, so that backs off from the one I just discussed. Inequality is found everywhere, but what is unequal and why differs based on cultural beliefs. The third principle is that stratification can persist over generations, meaning that many may stay within the same levels economically, educationally, within a level of power as the parents, the grandparents, the great-grandparents. So their level of stratification can be the same for generations. The fourth principle is that stratification always involves beliefs. Again, what is unequal and why is based on the culture's ideas and values and thoughts. And so those may differ from culture to culture, and the beliefs cause differences in what is unequal. So the 4 principles of stratification is that stratification is a trait in all societies. It is universal but varied. It can persist over generations, and it always involves beliefs. When we look at the systems of stratification, there are two types of systems when we look at this, an open system and a closed system. An open system, which is based on achievement, allows for movement and interaction between the different levels and or classes. So again, this allows movement from one level to another. It allows for interaction between the people in the different levels, and it's based on really kind of meritocracy. It's based on your achievement. So if you work harder and you get a better paying job, you're going to move up, or if you lose that job, you're going to move down. So an open system allows for social mobility, the movement of up and down. Now, a closed system accommodates little if zero change in a social position. It does not allow people to shift levels, nor does it permit mostly social relationships between the levels. So there is no movement from one level to the other and no or little interaction between the people in them. So the two types of systems are open system and closed system. While there are two types of social stratification systems, there are four forms of stratification or four ways in which stratification can present itself. Those are slavery, caste, estate systems, and class systems. So we're going to look at each of these. You will notice that slavery, caste system, and estate system are all closed systems, which again, very little to no movement, and class system is the only open system of stratification. Now, when we look at slavery, slavery tends to be the number one form of stratification that comes to mind when people think about stratification. There are actually four kinds of slavery that is found across the globe. Chattel slavery is the one you're automatically going to think of. That is the one that is persistent. That's the one that is in the history of the United States. Chattel slavery is when one person legally owns another person as property. Now again, keep in mind at the time of slavery here in the United States did not have the largest population of slaves in the world. There were other countries that had far greater number of individuals in chattel slavery than the United States. We also must keep in mind that the United States is the only country in the history that has ever gone to war against itself for the issue of slavery. So again, chattel slavery is the type of slavery in which one individual legally owns another individual as property. The remaining three are situations that equate to kind of like a slavery, meaning the situations really makes it so that the person is stuck where they're at. They have the freedom to move about. They have the freedom to change and get out of this situation. However, circumstances are that they really can't do it. So the first type is debt bondage. Debt bondage is also known as indentured servitude. You may have learned that in history. But debt bondage or indentured servitude is when you owe a person an amount of money and you have agreed to some form of paying it back, typically in the form of labor. Indentured servitude is actually the number one or highest form of slavery in which the immigrants coming into the United States came in. So we had more individuals coming from various countries into the United States under indentured servitude than we actually had individuals coming in as chattel slavery. So the indentured servitude was typically they would borrow money or for passage to the United States or borrowed money for some other reason, and they typically worked that off for an average of about 7 years. At the end of the 7 years, they could move on and they had paid the debt. Now, the problem with debt bondage is that while you are working off your debt, things are going to happen and you're going to need money, and so you're going to borrow more money, and so the situation just kind of keeps propelling itself to the point where you are under so much debt to an individual that you really cannot afford to leave, because you'd have to pay the debt in full, and you can't do that. So the circumstances get it so that you cannot leave. Child labor is another form of slavery. This still exists today in many, many countries. Child labor around the world in many cultures, children as young as 4 and 5 go to work. And this is for the reason, one of two reasons, is either A, they go to work to help pay off a parent's debt, or they go to work because it is detrimental if they do not. Basically, the family needs every individual working to bring in money so that they can survive. The fourth type is called servile forms of marriage, and this is when a young girl or young lady or woman is married off more like a business arrangement in which she has no say in the situation. So that is slavery. Now, the caste system is the second type of system, and a caste system is one in which people are born into their social standing and will remain there in their whole lives. Most of these are assigned based upon a religious belief. The largest system is the Hindu caste system. These are, there are like 1,000 different levels in the Hindu system. The highest level being the Brahmas or the priests, the lowest called being the untouchables. So you will be born into the level that your parents are in, and you will remain within that level. You will never be able to move out of that level. Opportunities are not available to you in the higher levels, or you'll never move down into the lower levels as well. You also cannot interact or marry outside of your own level. The third type of system is the estate system. In history, you would have also learned this as the feudal estate system. And so the estate system is the one that is with the lords and has some type of nobility, and then the serfs or the peasants. So the nobility own the land, own the businesses, own the manufacturing and the factories, and then you have the peasants or the serfs who work them. Now, when this first started, it was looking at land. So the nobility owned the land, and the serfs would then live upon the land and be granted the ability to work upon the land, and then they would give a portion of what they raised to the lord or the nobility in exchange for protection and other goods. Now, the class system is the only system that I've said. It is the system that you are familiar with. So the upper, middle, and lower class system, it is based on socioeconomic factors only. There are 3 different ways in which we can measure social class. The first is called the objective method. The objective method is using some quantifiable factor, which means that we use one factor that cannot be questioned. It is or it isn't, and we use this to determine social class. Now, our government uses socioeconomic or your wealth. It is what it is. You either are worth this amount of money or you're not, and then they use that wealth to place you within the class system. Other methods of class system that we can look at could be levels of education. Tends to be based on the type of job, but it tends to be the higher the education, the more money you make. So you either do have a 4-year college degree or you don't, or you have a master's degree or you don't, or whatever it is, it's objective and you cannot argue it. Now, the second type is subjective method. Anything that is subjective is based upon a person's opinion or thoughts. Subjective means that it's not based in fact. And so subjective method is an example of that would just be asking somebody what social class they belong to. Now, what happens is most people have their level of social class wrong. They actually have them lower than what our government places, because an individual is going to say, well, I'm a member of the lower middle class, and you're basing it off of your everyday household budgets and what you can and cannot afford. But remember, the government places us in our class system based upon the amount of money before taxes. So the government is always going to have you in a higher tier than you have yourself. And a lot of people have no idea what social class they fall into. If you pay your taxes, and if you have an accountant or have someone, then you need to know specifically what tier in the social class system that you fall into, and that is based upon the percentage of what you pay for taxes. So if you don't know that and you are paying taxes, you need to know that. You need to know that based on where government puts me, I'm paying 10% into taxes or 15% into taxes or 30% into taxes. You need to know that. Now, the third type of method we can use to measure social class is called reputational method. And this basically is taking one individual from a group that has a high level of esteem or prestige that people tend to respect. And then we ask them, okay, in this group, who's in what group? Now, again, the problem with this is that person is making assumptions based on external factors, and they could be very wrong. Let's just say you ask the mayor of your town to say who's in what social class, and so they may go, well, the people that live over here in the country club, they would be in the higher social class, and the people that live over here near the factories are in the lower. And actually that's an assumption based upon location. I, for example, know many people who live in $500,000, $1 million houses and are very broke and have very little money. But then I also know a multimillionaire who lives in a small home, what we call a mill town, and his grandmother raised him, and that is where he grew up, and it was near an old factory, and the houses around that area were called mill houses, and he lives there, and she gave it to him, and he's a multimillionaire. So the problem with this again is you're looking at subjective, someone's opinion. So again, just to know, the 4 forms of stratification are slavery, caste system, estate system, and class system. Also know which ones of these are closed and which one is open. When we look at the open stratification system, remember, allows for movement, we use the term social mobility. Now, social mobility refers to the ability to change positions within a social stratification system. Social mobility is that ability to move about the system. Now, there are 5 types of social mobility that I want you to know. The first is horizontal social mobility. So horizontal moves from side to side. So what this means is that, for example, you have a job making $60,000 a year, and then you take a job making $80,000 a year, okay? However, that $80,000 a year isn't enough to move you up to a higher level. It just keeps you in the same level you're at. So you're moving from one position to another, but remaining in the same level. Now, vertical social mobility is the moving up and down. So let's say you start out in a position or a job making $60,000 a year, and that puts you in one level, and then you take a job making $150,000 a year, that moves you up. Okay, or you have that $150,000 a year and you it closes, or you get fired or whatever, and you have to take the job at $60,000 a year, it moves you down. So vertical allows you to move up and down. Now, intergenerational, highlight, underline, circle the prefix inter. Inter means between. So intergenerational occupation is actually a type that is where you are comparing one generation social mobility to another generation. Okay, so that could be that we follow the social mobility of our parents' generation, and then we look at the social mobility of ourselves and we compare the 2 generations. Okay, Now, intra-generational, so circle, highlight, underline the prefix intra. Intra means one. That is watching the social mobility of one individual throughout their lifetime or one specific group of people throughout their lifetime. Now, both intergenerational and intragenerational are a type of occupational social mobility. So if you are asked a question to name the 5 types, I do not want you to name occupational as one of them. I'm just letting you know that intergenerational and intragenerational are occupational social mobility. Now, the last type of social mobility is structural, and structural means that large groups of people move either up or down the social ladder based on some social factor outside of their control. So for example, if we have a recession and a large amount of people lose their job, then a large amount of people are going to move down. That's structural. Let's look at what just happened with the lockdowns in COVID. So many businesses had to close due to government stating that it was unsafe to have them open, that millions and millions and millions of people lost their incomes. So they moved down that social ladder, and that was due to a social factor outside of their control. So again, the 5 types of social mobility are horizontal, vertical, intergenerational, intragenerational, and structural. This chart is breaking down the 3 sociological perspectives and their view on social stratification. So I'm not going to discuss this, but you can look at it. It breaks it down as far as the functionalist perspective on social stratification, the conflict theorist, and then the interactionist. It looks at their views on the purpose of stratification, why inequality exists or why inequality is needed, and then the analysis of the wealthy and how inequality affects each individual or group. So know this chart so that you know what the 3 perspectives view on social stratification is. So in chapter 10, we're going to take stratification and apply it globally. Again, remember that I stated that all cultures and countries around the world have some form of stratification. So I want to look at the term global inequality. Now, global inequality is concentrating resources in certain nations and is significantly affecting the opportunities of individuals in poorer or less powerful countries. So when you look at global inequality, it's where major resources, whether that be natural resources such as oil or minerals, water, whatever it may be, or it may be resources such as corporations and factories and businesses. Global inequality is where a large concentration of those resources are in a few number of nations, making them more wealthier and more powerful, and then thus leaving those with less power and less resources to be below those. Now, when we look at social stratification, the term refers to an unequal distribution among nations. So there are 2 dimensions in this stratification. It's gaps between nations and then gaps within nations. So when I say between nations, it's looking at the unequal distribution between different countries. So looking at the distribution of resources of the United States compared to that of Sierra Leone, or compared to that of India, or compared China to that of South Korea or North Korea. So between. But then we also can look at global stratification within each country and how stratification is existing within that country themselves. So I need you to know the difference between global inequality and global stratification. When we look at social stratification and global inequality, not only is economic inequality an impact, or economics is a reason that creates inequality and creates the differences in the stratification between nations and within nations. We also need to keep in mind social inequalities also have a harmful impact on groups of people between nations and within, based on prejudice and discrimination between things based on race, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, whatever it may be. There may be some social factors that within that culture creates prejudice and discrimination, and thus allows certain groups of people to be higher or certain groups of people to be lowered. So what I need you to know is that both economic and social factors create inequalities, and when we look at social inequalities, it is usually based upon different factors such as race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, that leads to prejudice and discrimination. When we talk about global stratification, we must look at how we classify nations when we are looking at this global inequality and global stratification. Now, one of the major concerns when we talk about global inequality is how to avoid some kind of bias or ethnocentric classification. Now, what you and I are used to are the terms first world, second world, third world, that sort of thing. We are also used to the terms developing or developed nations, or non-industrial and industrialized nations. Now, the problem with this is inferring that a developing country or a non-industrial country is somehow lesser than a developed or industrialized nation, and so therefore the developing country needs to do something to move itself up to become industrialized. So there were throughout history, we have used different ways of terminalizing or using terminology to classify the different types of nations. Now again, the most used is first world, second world, third world, and that was during the Cold War era, so 1945 to about 1980, and this was based upon economic development and standard of living. So when we did this, we looked at capitalist democracies or countries such as the United States and Japan, and they were known as first world. So first world countries, even Western Europe, they were the most wealthy and had the highest level of living standards. And then the poorest, of course, the most undeveloped countries would have been referred to as the third world countries. And so those would have been the ones that had the highest amount of poverty. The second world, of course, is in between, so nations not quite developed, so they're not as wealthy as the first world, but not as poor as the third world countries. Today, we do not use these terms first world, second world, and third world countries. What we moved into then in about the 1980s was Emanuel Wallerstein's world system approach, and this used economic bases as well to understand it, but his system supports an economic hierarchy that placed some nations in positions of power with numerous resources and other nations in a state of economic subordination. So what happened is some nations had more power and resources, and those were called the core nations. Now the core nations are the dominant capitalist countries. They're highly industrialized, have a high level of technology, and are urbanized. So the United States is one of the core nations, so is England, and so is Germany and China. So you're looking at where the nations are that have the highest level of capital, highly industrialized. And then of course you're seeing within this that some of the core nations were exerting power over every aspect of the global economy, and then they were exploiting the peripheral and semi-peripheral nations. So we were taking advantage of nations that were poorer or had less power. And so we actually had what is called the free trade agreements, such as the North American Free Trade Agreement, also known as NAFTA. And that was an example of how the core nations were able to leverage its power to gain the most advantages when it came to global trading. Now, what happened was NAFTA allowed these core nations to be in control and to take advantage of the poorer nations. Now, one of the things that happened during President Trump's presidency and his administration is he actually got rid of NAFTA. And he said this is not fair that only certain nations hold the most power and the most resources and are taking advantage of this. And so he actually pulled the United States out of NAFTA, which our biggest connections with NAFTA was to Mexico and Canada. But he did apply this globally. So we actually pulled out of that. Now it's going to be interesting to see what the current President Biden and his administration do if they move us back into NAFTA. Now, the nations that are in the middle are called the peripheral nations, and these have nations that have very little industrialization. And so this is where the factories and the means of production will be placed, but they will be owned by the core nation. So this is an example of when the factories and manufacturers in the United States closed their factories here, moved them to Mexico and other countries because the labor there was cheaper, and we could make the product cheaper and then ship it back into the United States than we could by making it here. Those nations are called the peripheral nations. And then the semi-peripheral nations are the in-between nations. Those really are the nations that have a major source of raw material. However, they don't have the ability to do things with them. They don't have the money to create businesses and factories and manufacturing. So Mexico is an example of a semi-peripheral nation providing abundant, cheap agricultural labor for the United States. China used to be where we could get products made cheaper, and China wasn't a powerhouse. However, now China has moved up to core nation. Semi-peripheral nations are those nations that are have very little industry, and then they rely on the businesses of the core nations to come in. So do know the difference between the Cold War stratification systems and the world systems approach. Continuing on the classifications, we have what is known as the World Bank economic classification. Now, this classification is based on income for individuals and or families. So while the World Bank is often criticized, both its policies and its methods of calculating data, it is still used to gather global economic data. Now, what the World Bank does is it's tracking the economy. The World Bank will track demographics and environmental health to provide a complete picture of whether a nation is a high income, middle income, or low income. So what the World Bank does is looks at the demographics basically on income, and then based upon what the people within that culture levels of income, then we decide whether that country is high income, middle income, or low income. So let's look at them. The World Bank defines high income nations as having a gross national income of at least $12,746 per capita. Now what that means is the gross national income per capita is the income or the average income of the people in the nation. So any country in which a person can make on average more than $12,746 a year is considered a high income nation. So examples of some of these: United States, Germany, Canada, United Kingdom, Sweden, Finland. Okay, so again, look at this and think about that. If you can make more than about $12,700 a year, you will be what is classified as a high income nation. Now, when we look at high income nations, there are two major issues that we look at. It's called capital flight and deindustrialization. Now, capital flight refers to the movement of capital from one nation to another. So that is when one nation has the ability to move businesses and or money in or out of other countries. Deindustrialization is a related issue where what is the consequences to a nation if they move the business or the money out? And how does that impact the individuals? Now let's look at middle income nations. The World Bank defines middle income economies as those with a GNI or gross national income per capita of more than $1,045, but less than the $12,746. So if the people in that country make more than $1,045, but no more than the $12,746, then those nations are being referred to as middle income nations. Now, those nations are nations such as Thailand, China, Namibia, actually some in India and in Central America or South America. Now, when we look at low-income nations, the World Bank defines low-income countries as nations whose GNI for individuals is $1,045 or less. Now, these countries are mainly found within the continent of Africa and many within Central America. So know the three different types and what the amount of money is that classifies for each. When discussing poverty and looking at it on a global basis, I like what your book says on page 212 under figure 10.5 when it says, what does it mean to be poor? And we can look at poverty as in 1,000 faces, and you are poor if you can't afford maybe cable TV or buy your own car. You might think you're poor if you see a fellow classmate with a new laptop and you actually have a very old desktop computer. He says, however, someone else might look at the clothes you wear or the calories you consume and consider you rich. So we must keep in mind that even poverty is subjective, and poverty based on where you are at means different things, or what constitutes poverty is different. So we're going to look at the three types of poverty, and that is relative poverty, absolute poverty, and subjective poverty. Now, relative poverty is a state of living where people can afford necessities but are unable to meet their society's average standard of living. So basically, relative poverty means you're able to pay your bills and you're able to live a moderate, comfortable life, but you can't afford the big houses and the fancy cars and the fancy trips. You can't keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. So relative poverty is you can afford to pay for the necessities and maybe even a little more, but you really can't live up to society's high standards. Absolute poverty, though, is a lack of even having the basic necessities, which typically includes food, clean water, safe housing, and access to health care. So absolute poverty means that those basic necessities are not even there. Now, when we look at absolute poverty defined by the World Bank, which we talked about earlier, a person in some cultures live on less than $1.25 a day. So according to the most recent estimates in 2011, about 17% of the people in developing worlds lived at or below $1.25 a day. 88 million people worldwide live in absolute poverty, and close to 3 billion people live on less than $2.50 a day. So when we look at poverty in the United States, And then we look at poverty elsewhere. If we compare relative poverty to absolute poverty, poverty in the United States is really, really less than the absolute poverty that we see in other cultures. Now, someone may say, well, our homeless live in absolute poverty, but that is not true. I want you to hear this statement loud and clear. Our homeless in the United States still live better than 88 million people in the world and 88 million people who live in absolute poverty and 3 billion people in the world who live on less than $2.50 a day. Now, what I'm saying is even our homeless in the United States has access to the necessities, the basic necessities. If they need housing, they can go to a shelter. If they need food, they can go to a food bank. If they need clothing, they can go to a place that hands out clothes. If they need medicine, they can go to the ER. So even our homeless live far better than the 3 billion people who live in the world under absolute poverty. Now, the third type of poverty is called subjective poverty, and this describes poverty that is composed of several dimensions or layers. It is subjectively present when your actual income does not meet your expectations or perceptions. So what this means is that you expect to live a certain way, or you have a perception of wanting to live a certain way, but your actual income doesn't get you there. And so that's called subjective poverty. Doesn't mean you're actually really poor. It just means that you are unable to live to the level that you think you should live. So just know the three types of poverty: relative, absolute, and subjective, and the difference between the three. Let's take a look at two theories that try to explain poverty, why it exists in certain places and not in others. When you look at this, you're going to look first at the modernization theory. Now, the modernization theory states that low-income countries could improve economically and by doing the following things. They could change their cultural views and attitudes towards work so that their beliefs and values fit more to the industrialized type cultures. And they could also develop industry based upon available resources that they have. So the modernization theory states that countries are basically poor because of their lack of industrialization. Okay, and the fact that they're not utilizing what resources that they have there. Now, many say that this is an ethnocentric bias, and it supposes that all countries have a level of resources or are capable of creating factories or businesses based around those. What we forget is it takes money to do that, and in these poorer nations, only a very select few have the money who would even remotely be able to do that. But the modernization theory says that you could improve economically by changing cultural views that may hold you back and adopting cultural views of the more industrialized viewpoint, and also developing the necessary resources you have available. Now, the second theory is the dependency theory, which states that core nations or high-income nations exploit semi-peripheral and peripheral nations for their resources, thus creating a dependency upon the core nations. So what it's stating is that the core nations will come in and they'll exploit these nations for their resources and for their cheap labor. And then these nations become dependent on these foreign companies to be in their country to provide the jobs. So there's a dependency theory. So that actually only makes the owners of the companies wealthier, and the people in the peripheral or semi-peripheral nations remain poor because they're working for these foreign companies. So the two theories of poverty are modernization theory and dependency theory.